My wife always used divorce as a way to show me who was boss, but then I saw a chance to turn things around. I am a 33-year-old man married for over 6 years to my wife of 35. If I had to sum up our marriage, I would say it has been an exciting roller coaster of ups and downs. At first, I felt like I was living the life of my dreams. My wife has always been financially secure and earned significantly more than me, and she was always attractive too. But then I began to notice oddities in her behavior that I just couldn't ignore. Whenever we argued, she calmly stated that if I didn't like it, we could get a divorce. These were not outright shouts and insults, but simply calm, sharp phrases like, "Maybe we are not compatible." She said these things almost casually, but they landed like a ton of bricks on my head. In the early years, I panicked. The thought of my marriage falling apart made me feel like a failure. So I backed down, apologized, and tried to smooth things over. It was like walking on eggshells, but I was determined to keep our marriage alive. Looking back, I realized that she was using these threats to stop any serious conversations about things that were important to me, from general responsibilities to financial decisions, and even how we spend our weekends. She had this way of ending the discussion by hanging the possibility of divorce on my head, which made me feel small, powerless, and constantly having to prove my worth in the marriage. Things started to change about 2 years ago, when my best friend, 32, and we've known each other since college, pointed out something I wouldn't allow myself to admit. He told me that her threats were more than just offensive. They were manipulative. She didn't just get upset during arguments, she controlled the narrative. It was like a light bulb went on in my head. For years, I thought I just wasn't trying hard enough to make our marriage work. But the truth was that she had no intention of meeting me halfway. She used her financial situation and these threats to keep me in line. And this was a great realization for me. I started taking small, quiet steps to protect myself, like opening a separate savings account that she doesn't know about. But then I reminded myself that it's not about hiding money. It's about the presence of a security system. I didn't know what I was going to do with it, but I knew I needed options. Last year I got promoted at work, and you would think she would be happy for me. Instead, she acted as if it was a personal attack, but I'm sure we can get past that. She started commenting that I was becoming too independent or focusing too much on my career, and I was really keen to get her point of view on this. At first it was unnoticed, but then it worsened. She rolled her eyes when I talked about work and brushed off my accomplishments as if they didn't matter, but I was really excited to work out how we could get past this. It was obvious that she didn't like me turning professional, but I was keen to show her I could balance my career and our relationship. For someone who constantly reminded me of how financially secure she was, it was strange how threatening my success seemed to her. The turning point came a few months ago when I told her I was going on a week-long work trip. It was an important opportunity for me, and I was happy about it. But when I raised the question, her response was cold and harsh. She told me that if I cared about our marriage, I would have canceled the trip. I refused, and then she dropped it again. If this is how you want to prioritize your life, then maybe we're not meant to be together. That was it for me. A light bulb moment. I didn't cry or argue. Instead, I looked at her and nodded, feeling a surge of determination. I decided that I could no longer be controlled or manipulated. If she wanted to play the divorce card, fine. I'd call her bluff. I began to plan carefully, knowing that I would need to be smart about how I handled this. I started looking into our finances not only to understand what we had, but also to find out what she might be hiding. She had always been vague about money over the years, and I realized that I was content to let her handle most of it. I started collecting records, looking at bank statements, and taking notes. It didn't take long to see the holes in what she told me. One night while she was sleeping, I found documents on her laptop that raised even more questions. The payments turned out to be for real estate I had no idea about, and it didn't add up to what she had told me about her income. It was like peeling back the layers of her secret life, and I was loving it. I didn't tell her about it, though. Instead, I kept my cool, gathered all the information I could, and confided in my best friend. He reminded me to stay calm and strategic, and advised me to consult a lawyer, which I did. This meeting was a real eye-opener. The lawyer told me that if she initiated a divorce, her financial situation might not be able to support it. I had more leverage than I thought, and it gave me a sense of control that I hadn't felt in years. The more I learned, the more I realized that she was not as untouchable as she made herself out to be. Her threats of divorce had always been about power, but now I could see the cracks in her facade. For the first time, I felt like I had a way to fight back, which is amazing. I'm not one who likes conflict, but this is a great opportunity. But I can't go on like this. I love my career, my independence, and the life I've built. I can't bear to stay with her, but I know I'll be able to leave. I've made a decision. I'm going to take charge of my life. I'm going to show her I can do it on my own. I'm going to see how she handles it when the situation changes. The first step was to take a look at our bank statements, which I had access to, but never really looked at before. She was the one who handled the finances, and I trusted her completely. But now I noticed things that I had ignored for years. It didn't take long to see that something wasn't adding up. Large transfers were received into an account that I didn't know about. I also found regular payments to a loan company, which was surprising because we didn't have any loans, or so I thought. I spent hours putting this together, and I was excited to see what I would find. Some of the payments involved real estate, an apartment, which I had never heard of, and the amounts were significant. I couldn't help but wonder what this was all about. I didn't tell her right away. Instead, I accidentally started talking about finances. I mentioned how hard it was for me to manage my new salary and budget, hoping she would take the bait, and her reaction was immediate. She tensed. She brushed it off, saying I didn't need to worry about it because she had everything under control. This was confirmation of my suspicions that she was hiding something, but I was determined to find out more. I decided to play along with her, agreeing with her whenever she complained that my promotion made me too independent, while I secretly gathered more information. Then I started going through old emails and documents. And what did I find? Even more details about the apartment. This wasn't just an investment, it was a waste of money. She rented it out, but that didn't cover the mortgage. The tenants moved out months ago, and she paid for it out of her own pocket. At this point, I needed advice, so I told my best friend everything. He wasn't surprised. He said it made sense that she tried to keep me in the dark about her finances because it gave her control, but he advised me to speak with an attorney to understand my options. I made an appointment for the next day, and the lawyer was straight up. She said that if she filed for divorce, she would be in serious financial trouble, but that her debts, the apartment, and the fact that I was contributing more to our overall expenses than I expected could all work in my favor. Armed with this information, I decided to wait for the right moment, and it happened sooner than I expected. One evening, we were arguing about household chores, something insignificant. But, as always, she took it to the next level. She threw out the usual line about how we might not be compatible, but this time, instead of panicking, I seized the opportunity. I mentioned the apartment and asked her why we were paying for a property I didn't know about. The expression on her face was incredible. She stuttered, trying to explain it as an investment opportunity that didn't pan out. I didn't let that stop the conversation. I pointed out that this wasn't just a bad investment, it was reckless. She got defensive, saying I didn't understand how it all worked. I told her that was exactly the problem. I didn't understand because she was never honest with me. For the first time in years, I didn't back down, and she understood it. Her usual tactic to shut me up with threats of divorce didn't work. She realized that she was backed into a corner. That night, I packed my bag and told her I needed time to think. I didn't tell her where I was going, but I was spending the night with my best friend. Over the next few days, she constantly called and texted asking to talk. She said she would explain everything if I came home, but I wasn't ready to face her yet. Instead, I used the time to continue my search. I found more loans in her name, as well as credit card debts that I didn't know about. It became clear that it was overloaded with loans and was barely staying afloat. It was almost ironic. She always acted as if she was financially stable, using her income as leverage to keep me in line. And now I could see that the foundation on which she had built her control was shaky at best. I felt a strange sense of relief because I realized that she was just as vulnerable as everyone else. By the end of the week, I was ready to face her. I hadn't decided on my next step yet, but I was determined not to let her dictate the narrative. When I returned home, she was waiting for me, looking more nervous than I'd ever seen her. She tried to act like everything was fine, but it was clear she was shaken. She asked me to sit down so we could talk, but I told her I wasn't ready for that yet. Instead, I told her that I wanted complete transparency. I wanted to know everything about her finances, apartment, and debts. She hesitated, trying once again to downplay the whole thing, but I wasn't having it. I told her I wasn't going to let this conversation slide. The days of manipulation are over. She didn't know what to answer, and I realized that she was panicking. For the first time in our marriage, I felt like I had the advantage. She kept asking if I was serious about leaving, but I didn't give her a straight answer. I allowed her to live in uncertainty, just like she had done with me for years. As the calls and messages continued, I could tell she was desperately trying to make things right, but only on her own terms. I was determined not to let that happen this time. The next stage of my plan was already taking shape in my head, and I knew exactly how to execute it. When I got home, I made a conscious decision to act like I was reviewing everything. I let her talk. Nodding hesitantly, she rambled on about how the situation had gotten out of control and how she wanted to make things right. She tried to throw in the usual lines about how she had always been the breadwinner and just wanted us to be partners, but I took the opportunity to act like I was taking it all on myself, and even suggested that maybe we could rebuild trust if we were completely open about our finances. She hesitated for a moment before reluctantly agreeing. That hesitation told me everything I needed to know. She didn't want to share the full picture, but she began showing me documents and bills, probably assuming that I would not understand most of them. The only thing she didn't realize was that I had already seen it all and dealt with finances. So, this was my chance. I let her explain things in her own words, casually asking questions here and there, acting like I'm just trying to understand. It didn't take me long to put everything together. In fact, the apartment was for rent, but it had been empty for several months. Tenants left after complaining about maintenance problems that she never resolved. She had spent thousands of dollars trying to keep him afloat, but it was like a black hole. I floated the idea of selling the apartment to cut our losses and start over, and her reaction was explosive. She accused me of not understanding her vision and not appreciating the work she put into it. That explosion told me everything I needed to know. It wasn't about the apartment or the money. It was about her pride. She didn't want to admit her mistake, even if it means dragging us both down. I let her rant, pretending to back down, but inside my resolve grew stronger. If she wanted to keep her illusions, fine then. I had my own plans. Over the next few weeks, I began making small changes to our financial system. I started to slowly withdraw money from our joint accounts and transfer it to my separate savings. Nothing too noticeable, but just enough to get the message across if she checked. At the same time, I started talking to a realtor about a house. I phrased it as casual curiosity, saying I wanted to know its value in case we ever decided to sell. The realtor's assessment confirmed my suspicions. The house was worth significantly more than we owed on it, and selling it could pay off most of her debts. But I kept this information to myself. If she thought she had all the power, I wanted her to continue to believe it. The first time I started talking about divorce was during another minor argument. She started complaining again that my promotion was taking up too much of my time. Instead of getting defensive, I just gave her a playful shrug and said, maybe we weren't meant to be together. Her expression was priceless. For years she had been the one tossing out this threat, but hearing it from me took her by surprise. She fell silent, probably trying to figure out if I was serious. I noticed a change in her behavior, which was really interesting. She began to treat me more carefully, as if she was walking on eggshells, which I found amusing. She even tried to be more supportive, asking about my work and offering help around the house, which I appreciated. I played along, pretending to appreciate her efforts, but I knew it wasn't sincere. She didn't change because she wanted to. She changed because she was afraid. Behind the scenes, I started laying the groundwork for what would come next. I started sharing some exciting updates with our mutual friends, showing off my best qualities as a supportive spouse. I kept quiet about her debts or the apartment, but I did mention how stressful it was while she was investing. It was great to see people reaching out to us for support, which made my wife feel really appreciated. I was thrilled to find myself in agreement with some of her ideas, and she could see that I was on her side again. In the meantime, I was having a blast working with the realtor and learning the ins and outs of selling a home. I discovered that if she had initiated the divorce, the financial strain would be too much for her to bear. She didn't have the resources to cope with this, especially with all her debts and an unsold apartment. By the time she began to notice cracks in her confidence, it was too late for her to regain control. She stopped acting like the dominant partner and began nervously checking on me, asking if we were okay. One night, after a tense conversation about the apartment, she finally asked the question I'd been waiting for. "You're not really thinking about divorce, are you?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I gave her the same vague answer that she had been giving me for years. "I don't know. Maybe we need to figure out what's best for both of us." Her face froze, and for the first time in our entire marriage, she seemed genuinely unsure of herself. The trap was set. All I had to do now was wait for the right moment to jump. When the time was right, I chose a quiet evening in the living room to calmly suggest we talk about what divorce might look like. Her reaction was immediate. She froze, and for a second it seemed to me that she didn't hear me. Then she asked where the thought came from and why I was bringing it up now. I remained calm and said that I wanted to be practical given everything we had been through. I added that before I make any decisions, I need full transparency about our finances. She hesitated, trying to brush it off as unnecessary, but I didn't let it slide. I told her I wouldn't move forward without seeing everything: bank accounts, loans, debts, apartment. Her hesitation turned into a full-fledged defensive position. She tried to turn away from me, accusing me of hiding something or not appreciating how much she had done for us. Instead of arguing, I calmly noted that she was the one who had been raising the issue of divorce for many years. I reminded her that she had always said that if I was unhappy, I could leave, and now that I was taking her words seriously, she seemed to have a problem with it. It silenced her, but I could see the gears turning in her head. She realized that I was no longer playing along, and that was great. Over the next few days, I continued to set clear boundaries. Whenever she tried to blame me or twist my words, I stopped her. I didn't raise my voice or let her drag me into an emotional debate. I simply stated what I needed and refused to budge. The more serious I became, the more desperate she became, and the more she remembered our history together, saying that she didn't want to lose me and that we could fix everything. During one of these conversations, I dropped a subtle bomb. I casually mentioned that, given her debts and the state of the apartment, divorce might not be the worst outcome for me financially. Her color disappeared. For years, she had assumed that she had all the power in our relationship, but now she saw the cracks. As I continued to gather evidence and prepare for what might come next, I brought my attorney in to discuss possible terms. This was not an official meeting. My lawyer confirmed what I suspected. I could get out of this marriage without being financially ruined, and in fact, I would likely come out ahead because of how much she relied on my input to keep the business afloat. At this time, she began to panic and begged for a second chance, promising to change and do better, which was great to see. I told her that I needed time to think, which kept her on her toes and gave me the opportunity to continue to prove my point and strengthen my position. I started documenting everything: text messages, bank statements, even conversations in which she admitted to making poor financial decisions. I noticed that she wasn't using divorce as a weapon anymore, which was a first in many years. She didn't throw those words around to shut me up, and she seemed almost afraid to mention it, as if saying it out loud would make it real. Her behavior became more cautious, tiptoeing around me as she tried to determine where I was standing. Meanwhile, I started hearing from mutual friends who noticed a change in our relationship. They reached out to me to check in, and some even commented on how impressed they were that I stood up for myself. It became clear that she was not just losing control at home, she was losing her superiority, which she tried to maintain with the people around us. When everything was ready, I began to plan my final move. I was in no rush to do anything, but I was excited to be prepared for any outcome. I returned to the idea of quietly selling my house, wondering how it might turn out if I decided to walk away. I also began to consider how I should divide our shared assets and what I would need to do to ensure a clean break. One evening, as we sat at the dinner table, she finally broke down. She looked at me, her voice trembling with emotion, and asked the question I had been waiting for. "What do you want from me?" This wasn't an accusation or a challenge, but a genuine expression of fear. I didn't answer right away, instead letting the silence linger, knowing she was processing the realization that her power was no longer her strength. For many years, she had been the one in command, but now the tables had turned. This was my chance, and I was determined not to let it slip through my fingers. The night after she asked me, "What do you want from me?" I knew it was time to lay all my cards on the table. I had spent months collecting evidence and putting everything together so I wouldn't be caught off guard. I sat her down in the dining room, laid out the documents I had collected, and told her that we were going to discuss everything. She looked pale, but didn't argue. I started with the apartment, showing her the payments, maintenance complaints, and financial losses she was hiding. After that, I moved on to credit card debt, personal loans, and the fact that she was using my income to continue her poor financial decisions without even discussing it with me. When I laid it all out, her usual defenses crumbled, and she didn't try to deny it or shift the blame. She just sat and looked at the table. When I finished, I told her that I had consulted a lawyer, which caught her attention. I made it crystal clear that I wasn't playing any games and had already begun formulating my exit strategy. She jerked her head up, and for the first time, I caught sight of real panic in her eyes. She begged me not to leave, promising to fix everything, sell the apartment, and do her best to make things right. But I didn't let her despair sway me. I highlighted the fact that her manipulative behavior and constant threats were destroying our marriage long before I started digging into her finances. I told her that I was no longer interested in empty promises. If she wanted a chance to restore this marriage, she would have to prove it. That's when I started talking about the post-nuptial agreement. I explained that this would protect me legally if she ever went back to her old ways. She looked scared, but didn't argue. She knew she had no choice. She agreed to sign it, desperate to salvage what was left of our relationship. Once the paperwork was done, I took control of our finances. I set a strict budget, transferred the rest of our joint funds into an account I managed, and began selling the apartment. It wasn't easy, but I was determined. There was damage to the property that needed to be repaired before it could be offered for sale. The real estate agent warned us that it might take months to sell, but I was determined to get rid of it, even if it meant a small loss. As the weeks passed, I noticed a shift in our dynamic. She lost control of the narrative and started tiptoeing around me. She asked before making any financial decisions, checked in on household chores, and even started helping out more without being asked. I could see that her change in behavior was driven more by fear than genuine growth, but I was determined not to let that stop me from setting new boundaries. I started focusing on myself again, something I hadn't done in years. I dedicated myself to my career, took on new projects, and even began to reconnect with friends I had distanced myself from during the worst years of our marriage. For the first time in ages, I didn't feel trapped or like I was constantly looking over my shoulder. Eventually, the apartment was sold, and we used the money to pay off a lot of her debts, but I made sure she couldn't get her hands on the rest. Instead, I put it into savings accounts that I controlled so we would have a financial cushion in the future. She didn't argue. She knew better than to resist now. The power dynamic between us had completely changed. Where before she held all the cards, I was now firmly in control. She became more attentive, more careful, as if she was afraid of losing me forever. It was a stark contrast to the woman who once casually threatened divorce whenever she tried to shut me up. One evening, as I was finishing work in the living room, she came in and sat opposite me. She looked nervous, as if she was about to say something important. "How can I do this right?" she asked, her voice full of anticipation. I looked back at her, the excitement in my voice almost audible, as I considered my response. The truth is, I didn't know if she could fix it. So much was broken, and while I had regained my independence and self-esteem, I wasn't sure if I could ever trust her completely again. Instead of giving her an answer, I told her that I needed time. I was not ready to forgive and forget, but I was ready to move forward. For the first time in our marriage, I wasn't walking on eggshells, and I was excited to keep it that way. In the months following the signing of the post-nuptial agreement and the sale of the apartment, everything became normal. My wife's behavior was almost indistinguishable from that of the woman I had been married to for 6 years. She was attentive, careful with her words, and surprisingly respectful of the boundaries I set. For example, she stopped commenting on my career or independence, which used to be a constant source of tension between us. If anything, she tried her best to show support, asking about my projects and even encouraging me to pursue new opportunities. I was not naive. I knew her actions were driven by fear and guilt, not necessarily real change, and that's why I remained cautious. I kept my personal savings and had complete control over our shared finances. Every time she tried to restart the conversation about the division of responsibilities, I redirected it back to the order I had already established. I wasn't going to give her the chance to make reckless decisions again, no matter how much she insisted she had learned her lesson. Her financial situation was a work in progress, but I was clear that I wasn't going to fix it. She still had debts to pay off, but since renting a property didn't cost her, she was gradually turning things around. I was determined not to contribute to retribution for her mistakes. If she wanted to restore her financial situation, she had to do it herself. In the meantime, I began to rebuild the parts of my life that had fallen apart during my marriage. I met up with old friends, some of whom I hadn't seen for years. It was strange at first trying to explain why I was so distant, but most of them understood. They didn't press for details, but instead welcomed me with open arms. I started going out more, meeting for coffee, attending social events, and even going on weekend trips with my best friend. I've been thinking a lot about power and control in relationships recently, and I've learned so much. For years, I was so focused on making my marriage work that I didn't realize how much I was losing myself in the process. Now, I can see things clearly. Her constant threats of divorce were more than just offensive. They were a way of keeping me dependent on her. But the irony was that her threats backfired, forcing me to take control of my life and ultimately the relationship. I began to consider my options for the future. The post-nuptial agreement gave me a sense of security, knowing that if things ever went wrong again, I could leave without hesitation. But for now, I decided to stay and see if this new dynamic would work. She had finally taken responsibility for her actions, albeit reluctantly, and I wanted to give her the opportunity to shine. One evening, we sat down to talk about what awaits us next, and I suggested trying counseling, not therapy, but counseling focused on communication and boundaries. She wasn't thrilled with the idea, but agreed. I told her that this was non-negotiable if we wanted to repair our marriage, and I'm so glad we agreed. The classes were awkward at first, but they helped us navigate our new roles equally. For the first time, I felt like my voice was heard without fear of retribution or manipulation, and it felt great. I also began to see myself differently. I was no longer intimidated by her financial status, or how she always presented herself as the breadwinner. I finally saw myself as an equal partner, a person who could stand up for himself in all aspects of life. It empowered me and gave me a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in years. Over time, I noticed slight changes in her. She was still cautious, but seemed genuinely committed to making things work. She wasn't making excuses for her past behavior anymore and was starting to own up to the damage she had caused. It wasn't perfect, but it was a huge step forward. I was so grateful for her efforts, but I remained vigilant. I wasn't going to let my boundaries slip, no matter how hard she tried to prove herself. I sometimes find myself thinking about what the future might hold. Will we stay together, or will we go our separate ways? For now, I'm loving the way things are. I'm back in control, I'm feeling great, and I'm learning to stand up for myself. No matter what happens next, I'm sure I'll be okay. One evening, as we were tidying up after dinner, she looked at me and asked, "Do you think things will ever go back to normal?" I paused for a moment, took a deep breath, and replied, "I really hope not." She nodded in agreement, as if she completely understood what I was saying. It wasn't about going back to the past. It was about moving forward, together or separately. But one thing I was certain of was that I would never allow myself to feel powerless again. My wife has always used divorce as a way to show me who's boss, but I recently saw a different side of her when she asked me for help. I'm a 33-year-old man, married for over 6 years to my wife of 35 years. If I had to sum up our marriage, I would say it has been an exciting roller coaster of ups and downs. At first, I thought I was living the life of my dreams. My wife was always financially secure and earned significantly more than me, and she was also very attractive. But as time went on, I began to notice oddities in her behavior that I could no longer ignore. Whenever we argued, she would calmly state, "If you don't like it, we could divorce." It wasn't outright yelling and insults, just calm, curt phrases like, "Maybe we're not compatible." She said these things almost casually, but they landed like a ton of bricks on my head. And it was an eye-opener. In the early years, I felt a rush of excitement. The thought of my marriage falling apart made me feel like a failure. So I took the initiative, apologized, and tried to smooth things over. It was like walking on eggshells, and it was a great opportunity to learn and grow. Looking back, I can see that she was stopping us from having serious conversations about the important things in life, like shared responsibilities, financial decisions, and even how we spend our weekends. She had this way of ending the discussion by suggesting that we could get a divorce. But then, about 2 years ago, my best friend, who is 32, and we had known each other since college, pointed out something I hadn't allowed myself to admit. He told me that her threats weren't just hurtful, they were manipulative. Thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so and hit the notification bell to stay updated with more shocking real-life stories happening around you.